Hey everybody, it's Dan. This is the Scandinavian Grandmaster game. It was played between Anatoly Karpov and Bent Larsen. For those who don't know, Karpov was of course the former world chess champion from 1975 to 1985, and Bent Larsen, while never gaining the title of world chess champion, was the first Western player to challenge Soviet dominance of chess in the 20th century. In fact, he beat all the world chess champions from 1948 to 1985, including Bobby Fischer, although he did have lifetime minus scores against all of them. So the point is that Larsen was a formidable GM in his time, and in the game we're going to look at, he uses the Scandinavian Defense to keep white to a small advantage out of the opening, and in the middle game is able to swing the game decisively in his favor and come out with the win over Karpov. So let's take a look. So we have the Scandinavian, e4, d5, the queen comes out and then swings over to a5 as we saw in the last video. From here, after white's expansion into the center with d4 and some more development with minor pieces, black strays a bit from book and hits a check with the bishop on g4. White blocks with its own bishop, and the pair of bishops comes off. The knight here recaptures with a discovered attack on the queen, which moves to b6, where it's still pressurizing b2. White ignores that, though, and develops knight f3, because if the queen captures on b2, after rook to b1, the b7 pawn falls, and black ends up losing a tempo on the queen. So obviously black does not go in for that, and instead after knight to f3 you have knight on b to d7, white castles, and black here plays e6, opening up access for the dark square bishop. And here white starts a pawn storm, moving up on the queen side and gaining a lot of space, and getting ready to unleash an attack on the black queen. Black, however, ignores that for the moment and continues with development bishop to e7. From here you have b4, black castles, and a4. Again, notice the pawn wall preparing to push forward and how cramped it is for the black queen. So black here plays c6 to give the queen an escape. Remember that c6 was a move we looked at in the last video, an important move for black to make in a lot of variations of the Scandinavian so that the queen can indeed escape. From here we have queen to c2, and this move completes white's development as signified by the connected rooks, and also protects the pawn on c4. From here, the black queen plays to c6, a move that would have had to have been played eventually, so black might as well do it voluntarily right now. This move is also supporting a c5 advance, since now the queen, knight, and bishop are all supporting that point. From white here we have rook on f to e1. This is protecting the knight on e2, and white has excellent coordination and a lot of space on the queen side. b6 prepares c5 even more, and a5 challenges b6 right away. Now, a word about the pawn structure here before moving forward. Pawn structures determine whether a position is open or closed. Closed means there are more pawns on the board, open means less pawns, and typically in a closed structure the pawns are opposing each other, locking each other in place. Changing the pawn structure typically is how one goes about either opening or closing a position. The tension here between a5 and b6 is very important, because if the pawn on b captures on a, we have a change in the pawn structure with the position opening up. As a rule, a lot of thought needs to be put into changing the pawn structure, and in this game we don't have b captures a, but rather rook on f to b8, reinforcing the pawn. And here, with the next couple of pawn moves, both sides decide to close the position for good now on the queen side. Now, I'm not going to go through all the variations of what would happen if the position opened up, but I would be interested in your thoughts on why both sides opted to close the queen side in this game. So, continuing with the game, we have knight to d5, since with white's last pawn move, the square d5 is now a hole. A hole is a square that can no longer be attacked by any pawns excluding captures, and so it's a very good place to get a piece if you can. Now we just have some repositioning of the pieces, very typical for the middle game, especially when one side of the board is completely locked up. White sets about getting its knight on e2 into a more centralized square, and black repositions the rooks onto semi-open files. Even though it looks strange now with the d and e files, particularly the d file clogged up at the moment, if and when they do open up, the black rooks will be in a great position to capitalize on it. White here gives its king an escape square, and notably it's on a light square, since black no longer has a light square bishop. Bishop to f6 does two things. It directly puts pressure on d4 and indirectly supports an e5 advance. Rook to e4, however, dampens both those initiatives. First of all, the pawn on d4 wasn't in any immediate danger of being captured, but the rook now provides additional support. Also, in this position, e5 is a huge mistake because of the in-between move that white would have of rook on a to e1, and the pawn is now caught in a pin, since capturing the pawn on d4 would drop a rook on the back rank, and as it stands, there are 5 attackers and 4 defenders of the pawn, so there's no way to get additional support to e5. So white here is definitely the preferred side now. Of course, after rook to e4, e5 is not played. Instead, we have knights to f8, and black here seems to start to flounder a bit. White goes ahead with the kingside initiative with h4, and black just shuffles its rooks. The queenside and the center are both locked up, and moving pawns on the kingside to try to dampen a kingside attack would only weaken the castle position. Even though shuffling rooks seems incredibly passive, after looking at this game, I'm really impressed with Larsen's patience in the position. He knows he has a solid defensive structure in place, and so waits for white to prove that they can crack the position as opposed to voluntarily making weaknesses. Meanwhile, white builds up its kingside attack, and black eventually ends up in a very cramped position that, as I mentioned, has a simultaneous feature of being a very solid fortress. White has a ton of space on both sides of the board, and very active pieces with the knight on e5, the rook on e4, and a kingside attack. But again, there isn't really a way yet to crack at black's position. Due to black's stubbornness earlier about not opening the kingside, there are practically no weak points for white to focus in on. White tries putting the bishop opposite the queen, but instead of capturing with the knight, which would unclog the position, that is, capturing the bishop with the knight, the black player simply sidesteps the discovered attack by playing queen to c8, which is also now tying the rook down to the protection of the pawn on a6. Here, the bishop backs up out of the knight's range, and this allows f6 from black, finally offering to open things up on the kingside. White here avoids doing this, however, and simply retreats the knight. Black now puts its rook on the f-file, which, while closed at the moment, is primed to open any minute now. White repositions the queen, and now finally the position begins opening up with an exchange of pawns on g5. After the rook sidesteps the attack from the knight, white here moves rook to a3, and I just want to pause for a second here. I'm not really sure why this move was played. Perhaps it was just a waiting move, but I really couldn't find anything that the move was accomplishing. It isn't attacking anything significantly. It's also not crucial to any sort of defensive structure. So, if any of you guys have any thoughts or anything about why this particular move is played in this position, please do leave a comment. The problem, though, that I could find with this move is that it seems a bit too passive, and it allows for black now to go on the attack, starting with knight to g6, vacating f8 for the other rook. White maneuvers the knight to target e5, and black here doubles up on the f-file. White plants the knight down there on e5, black captures it, and here, according to the computer, white makes a blunder which turns the tide in favor of black for the rest of the game. Of the 4 pieces with which to recapture, white chooses the rook. But according to engine analysis, knight capturing on e5 was stronger for the simple reason that now f4 is protected by the knight, rook, and king. However, after the rook captures on e5, f3 is vulnerable, and black immediately jumps into the square with its rook. Now, in this position here, according to computer analysis, the advantage has already begun to swing in black's favor. But unfortunately for white, it plays another move that is too passive and doesn't fully take into consideration black's position. Here, white just plays rook to a1. Now, here comes a nice shot from black. If you'd like, you can pause the video and see if you can find it, but I'm just going to show it to you now. Black simply captures the pawn on h4, getting another pawn in the position. The bishop is actually immune from capture, because if the bishop does capture on h4, rook to d3 is a killer move. It attacks the queen and the d4 pawn, and if the queen captures on d3, boom, look at that fork, game over. Now, in this position here, of course, White sees this and refrains from capturing the bishop. Instead, White plays the queen to e2, but after the bishops are exchanged, White decides to cash in and exchanges the queen for Black's rooks. Now, this is not unheard of in Grandmaster play, of course. Technically, it wins 1 point of material since the queen is worth 9 points and the rooks together are 10. But it creates a great need for the side giving up the queen to be coordinated at all times, while the side with the remaining queen has to be extra cautious not to lose the queen, because if it does, then of course the game will be over. So in other words, from this point going forward, sharp play is required from both players. So in this position, Black goes ahead and captures the pawn on b4, and if White recaptures with the knight, then queen to d4 hits everything. The rooks could get connected and protected, but then there goes the knight, and with the pawns in this endgame, Black definitely has the advantage. So to go back here, instead of capturing the knight, White simply moves the rook over to d1, and now this has the very real direct threat of winning the knight, so Black crashes through onto d4, picking off yet another pawn. White attacks the queen, but Black just pins the rook to the king. Knight to f2 opens a discovered attack on the queen, but now she just swings over to h5 and hits check. The king here retreats to g2, and Black saves the knight but loses the pawn on e6. Here, h6 prepares a little cubbyhole for the king where he'll be safe for the rest of the game. We have a little bit of repositioning going on here, and then we have the pawn on b4 getting pushed for Black. g4 attacks the queen, and so she just moves out of danger. We have more repositioning of the pieces until we come to this position right here. Now, in the game, Black immediately pushed pawn to h4 check, and according to the computer analysis, the position is still heavily in favor of Black by almost 6 material points. But the computer actually found a move that in this position Black missed, and that was simply to push the passed b pawn. What would have happened after the pawn was pushed would be that, of course, White would have to get behind the pawn right away, but now we have h4 hitting a check, and this kicks the king back, and then Black pushes the pawn again. Now, White needs to stop the pawn from queening, of course, and so here they would have to play rook to b3. Actually, if in this position, immediately capturing the pawn with the rook would run into the tactic here of hitting a check. Basically, in order to save the rook on f3, the king would have to play to f2, and then from here you can just hit another check and you end up picking off the rook. So that's why in this position, White would need to be patient and put the rook behind the pawn on b3 there. But in this position, after the pawn queens and the rook recaptures, you'll notice that now it has left the third rank, and this allows Black to hit a check on g4. Now, if the rook was still on the third rank, it would still be protecting the knight. But since it's not there anymore, after the king retreats, there goes the knight, and Black is now up even more material. So that's a line that the computer found that Black could have played in this position right here. Let me back it up. So in this position right here, nope, sorry. Here we go. In this position right here, Black definitely could have pushed the b pawn, but as was played in the game, you had an immediate h4 check, and again, according to the computer analysis, this is still very much a one game for White. For Black. So after the check, the king retreats to g2. We have b3 inching the pawn ever closer to the queening square, and we have rook to b8. But here it's it's too little, too late. Queen to e2 check effectively seals the deal. Now in the game we had the knight playing to f2 to block the check, but after knight to e3 check, there is no way to protect the rook, and White here resigned. But to go back here in this position, it's worth noting that if rook to f2 to block, this is not actually much better. It only delays the inevitable. Again, in this position, we would have knight to e3 check, and the king can avoid it all he likes, but eventually the rook will fall. Just one example here is if the king plays to h1, you can have queen to e1 check, forces king to h2, and then there goes the fork on g4. Alternatively, if in this position we had the king playing back to G1, well, that would fall to the tactic of hitting a check on G4, and then after another check, black is actually going to end up picking off a lot of material here, and this is obviously a one game as well. However, as it was in the actual game, once the queen hit the check here on E2, the knight blocked, and after the knight check on E3, Karpov ended up resigning to Larsen. So that's the Scandinavian Defense as played by two very respectable grandmasters. As I mentioned, I really enjoyed seeing Larsen's patience in the middle game. I know that I definitely would have been tempted to make a pawn move to protect my king, but that would not necessarily have been good, since any pawn move would also create a weakness that white could then exploit. So it was very nice to see Larsen's patience pay off in the end. And also, this game does show that the Scandinavian can in fact be a very solid defense. So that's all for this video. Question, comments, ratings, all that stuff is appreciated. And I hope you enjoyed the video, and see you next time.